Hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is May 16th, 2023. Who do you have the pleasure of speaking with today?
I'm speaking with Lance, middle initial D for David, Hart, H-A-R-T.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Mr. Hart. If you can just begin by letting me know when you started at the water management districts and and how long you were working there.
Okay, I started working for the St. Johns River Water Management District, April of 1988. And I just recently retired the end of March 31st, 2023. So I completed a 35-year career at the Water Management District. Prior to that, I was an environmental consultant for just short of 5 years, which was the catalyst for making the relationships to make the jump from the private sector to the public sector.
Fantastic. And so the water management districts, I mean, that's not something that typically, every single person goes into. How did you find yourself in that career? So you were environmental consultant first. Kind of tell me a little bit about that journey.
Started working for a company called Coastal Zone Resources Incorporated. They originally were located in Wilmington, North Carolina. And, my 2 years prior to that and working with a consulting firm, you see where the threads of my dad were interwoven with the start of my career. Fortunately, I'm very thankful that I had a father that with his career was able to not actively, but because of where he was, provide avenues of opportunity for me. So a gentleman that he had known through working at CZR and owned the company had heard that I just returned from Nepal doing biology work, and he needed a field biologist to work on a 10,000 acre project in Martin County, go out all day and collecting all kinds of stuff, data, plant data, transects. So that's how I was hired and helped close the office that they formerly had in Wilmington, North Carolina, because they moved their headquarters to Jupiter, Florida. So I brought down the last of the office in a U-Haul trailer. Had borrowed $80 from my older sister, had my 2 surfboards, my 12-speed bike, and a bed mattress. And that's how I arrived in Florida, October of '83. And started working with CZR mostly on that project in South Florida. And then they branched up into Northeast Florida in the Jacksonville office and started interacting with a lot of the biologists from the Water Management District at that time through my career, because I was mostly doing the original site assessments for development projects, whether they're subdivisions, office parks. As an example, I delineated all the wetlands in the northeast quad of I-95 and John J.T. Butler Boulevard in Jacksonville. Everyone knows now that's where St. Luke's Hospital and all those office parks were. But when I did the original delineation, that was the Skinner dairy location. So that was all improved pasture with their dairy barn and hundreds of cows that were driving their milk business. So that's how I started, and people with the Water Management District often reviewed lines, the permit applications that I submitted, the mitigation plans that I prepared through offset wetland impacts. And towards the end of my career with the consulting firm, I had been elevated to office manager position, but I was also responsible for working projects from the border of Virginia, North Carolina, all the way down to the Keys. And oftentimes would be living out of a suitcase for 2 to 3 weeks, traveling to different projects, doing assessments, flagging. Oftentimes the president of the company would call me at 10 o'clock at night to get a summary of how the day went and tell me that they just picked up a new project and a plane ticket to be waiting for me at the local airport, and who I was supposed to contact when I landed, rental car be ready for me. And after about 6 months of that, I realized that was not a tenable lifestyle to have. When you start having a first name basis relationship with hotel clerks and wait staff in restaurant, you know that your life is not very full. So a couple of the folks that I worked with the water management district started basically promoting the district and recruiting me. And I just reached a point where, it was just too much, and there was a job opening available in the Orlando office that they had, just a couple of years before opened up. And I went down and interviewed, and I was hired to start work. And I tendered my resignation in March from the consulting firm. And within a week, I had transitioned over to working for the water management district.
Wow, what a fascinating kind of background. So
Yeah.
were you trained as a biologist? Is that what your degree was in?
Yes.
Your position was in the water management districts?
As a biologist. So I was hired, and I'm not going to get too much into the details, but there was a personnel issue that was occurring in the Orlando office. And I was mostly recruited to come in and solve that personnel issue. And that individual was going to be moved into a different section, but there was a lot of backstory going on. So when I started at the district, I didn't go into that position that I was originally hired, which was to supervise all of the regulatory scientists that were doing permit evaluation. So I started off as the name was changed, but I'm going to use the regulatory scientist. We were called environmental scientists, but ultimately our titles were changed to regulatory scientists to differentiate us from the environmental scientists that were in the research section of the district. We were all called the same thing, but we had vastly different job responsibilities and, to a degree, even experience level. So, our managers to make a distinction between the two tracks changed our titles to regulatory scientist.
Can you discuss the specific differences between those two tracks? So what would an environmental scientist do as opposed to a regulatory scientist?
Well, just by management, we were looking for people that were more generalist in terms of their biology background, because as a person that reviews permit applications, not only are we, having to be knowledgeable in plants with wetland delineation at the time that I started, you're having to know endangered species, you're having to be able to review construction plans, understand hydrology. Whereas in the environmental, it's the water resource section, that's where research projects were going on. And they were looking for people that were typically specialists and PhDs to do specific research projects that were associated with water quality or with habitat restoration, that all feed into the many restoration projects that the district has ongoing, like the Upper Basin Restoration Project, the Lake Apopka Restoration Project. So what the two different divisions are looking for in terms of skill sets with their employees was different. So that's where, to make sure that we were able to recruit the specific skill sets that we needed, they realized that a title change was needed, which then resulted in having a different position description narrative that we would advertise for. So if that makes sense, I mean, the water resource folks didn't want somebody that, was applying to a canned advertisement that was nowhere within the skill sets that they were looking for. And we didn't need somebody that was, way overqualified and such a specific focus on what they had done coming into the regulatory world, if that makes sense. And it's a very big generalization, but that's kind of the difference. It's the research folks, and it's the folks doing kind of application of biology and reviewing applications to make sure that our rules and regulations are being adhered to.
Yeah, so it's more research focused as opposed to policy focused.
Policy or application.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a couple PhDs that I met that were representing property owners, and they just tried to denigrate me by just calling me an applied biologist, not a real biologist. But whatever. they could have their PhDs and be their focus. But at the end of the day, the rule is the rule, and it's black and white. And that's what you have to follow, regardless of what your background, your education, whatever is. So that's, back to the track. That's what I was hired to do. So it took a couple months for the backstory thing to work out. And then I became the supervisor of the regulatory scientist in the Orlando office, July of '88. So there was about a 3-month, gap before I actually stepped into the role that I was recruited to fill.
And then so kind of discuss kind of how your position kind of evolved over the course of 35 years. I mean, what different levels of management did you eventually kind of reach, or that type of thing?
Well, it almost sounds like I would have been in a rut, because I basically stayed as the supervising biologist until we moved as a family from Orlando to Fruit Cove, October of '99. And when I moved up, I basically took a lateral transfer, but a title change. So I went from being a supervising regulatory scientist in Orlando to being the technical program manager for our wetland delineation program. And don't let me forget not to cycle back to that. But because of budget cuts and some other things, my responsibilities were not too different from what I had in Orlando, in that I was still supervising regulatory scientists doing permit review out of the Palaca office. And I was also still getting assigned special projects, like partly because of the skill set that I came into the district with. I kind of got tagged with some special things in my opinion. So
can you discuss those special things a little bit more? So like
and trying not to get too drilled down into the weeds. We have our environmental resource permits would deal with basically the water quality, wetlands, environmental aspect, and floodplain. But we also have our consumptive use permitting program, our water use program, which is the allocation of groundwater. And in the time that I started with the district, hydrologists were the sole reviewers of those, even though under the criteria for issuance, there was an environmental aspect that a CUP couldn't adversely harm wetlands or existing land users or land uses, but no biologists were reviewing them. And in '91, we were challenged on a recommendation to issue a well field expansion for the city of Cocoa into Orange County. Objectors were large landowners that were around this new well field, Deseret Ranches, which is the Mormon-owned church that have a huge land holding in Central Florida and Orange, Brevard, Osceola County. Just Google them. It's farm reserve now, but they used to be known as the Deseret Ranches.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. The huge property. It's cattle, right? Yeah.
That's right. Mostly cattle, but they also do timber. They also do citrus and lots of other things. So the well field expansion was down the Withlacoochee Road, which was a public road right away. But that road cuts right through the middle of Deseret Ranch. and also another rancher was Holland Ranch. So Deseret Ranch, Holland Ranch, Orange County, and the city of Orlando all objected to us issuing that permit. And one of the items of objection was that there would be huge environmental harm. So we had already done our review, said we were going to approve it, and suddenly we're having to go into litigation. I got tagged as the person to come in and do a retro review of the whole application and to defend our recommendation through litigation. And that started a period of time where not only was I reviewing the RSs in Orlando, reviewing my own permit applications, and we had also been delegated, or we started a wetland delineation program. I started having to testify and review CUP applications that were issued. So I went through hearings for the city of Cocoa, the Taylor Creek Reservoir that was proposed, but got settled just before the day before hearing. South Brevard Water Authority, wellfield that was proposed in Bull Creek Wildlife Management Area. New Smyrna Beach, I was involved in pre-litigation with Daytona Beach. A rule violation on the Wekiva Falls Resort because the gentleman said that all he did was pipe a natural spring, but what he did is he illegally put in a groundwater well. So I got pulled in to prove that it wasn't a spring previously. So I was doing all these things, still being a supervisor RS, but well outside of what was the normal job responsibilities of the supervising RS. So then when I moved to the Palaca office as the technical program coordinator, I basically then was responsible for ensuring consistency district-wide with our staff delineation of wetlands, as well as overseeing our specific formal wetland delineation program. And again, because of staffing issues, where I had been reviewing petitions for formals in the Orlando office, I still retained that responsibility because my replacement couldn't do it with staffing shortages and other issues. So I still had to do all of that, still supervise staff. And then I got tagged by our upper management with helping the district through a period of time that we were needing to get our permit applications for all of our construction activities associated with the restoration and enhancement projects. So I started being basically a consultant again for the district, putting together permit applications for our federal permits from the Corps of Engineers, our permits from DEP, the state permits, as well as local government permits. And having to go to county commission meetings and meetings at the Corps and DEP to represent the district in the process of obtaining permits for our construction activities. Still while doing formals and still while supervising RS staff. So even though my job titles didn't really change much in my 35 years, because I stayed as the technical program coordinator until I retired, I've been picking up all of these extra responsibilities. And then in 2013, we realized that our monitoring for consumptive use permits wasn't really getting us the answers we needed. So I got tagged in a 4-staff working group to revisit what we were doing, as well as if we could come up with recommendations for defining harm from groundwater use on lakes and wetlands, which resulted in coming up with recommendations for a whole new monitoring strategy for our well fields, which then put me on a track to being involved with the Central Florida Water Initiative, because the steering committee for that directed one of the working groups, which was known as the Data Management Investigations Team, to set up a regional wetland monitoring network to fill in the gaps, both and by gaps, with the well field, we were doing monitoring, but South Florida had their way of doing it. Southwest Florida had their method. We had our method, which we realized wasn't working, and we were moving to a new method. So the steering committee said, there's apples, oranges, and grapes. We need something that is apples for everybody so we can define what's going on, as well as each well field had their footprint. But in reality, the groundwater impact in the Florida aquifer was stretching well outside of all of these individual little stamps, if you will. So we needed to set up monitoring in those regional areas between all of the well fields that were being monitored to make sure that we were missing things. So I ended up becoming the team lead between the three districts in setting up a regional wetland monitoring network. And I started working on that in 2014 on up to my retirement, in addition to still doing, formal wetland determinations.
Even if there is a legitimate understanding that, each spring might be a little bit different, each wetland might be a little bit different, etc. Why don't the water management districts kind of have more of a, universal kind of language when it comes to approaching certain issues? I mean, it's like there seems to be even like a disjointness about even working together, despite these bodies of water bleeding into each other.
Yeah, well, I'd have to say that there's a huge effort in trying to make sure that we are dancing the same dance to the same music. But part of, and this is my opinion, and you probably may have heard this or come to the same conclusion with your interviews if you've looked at the history of the districts. And it comes down to just the structure of the districts, because the legislature enabled the districts to be formed back in the early 70s. The legislation kind of took time before districts got established. So the first district that was set up in the state of Florida was South Florida. And just on a very simplistic, generalized way of looking at it, they being the first are the most autonomous of the 5 water management districts in terms of how they can operate. They have less checks and balances, both through the executive branch, who appoints the board members, as well as legislatively. They also have the highest millage rate.
I'm sorry, millage rate means what?
So the millage rate is, the legislation allowed the districts to apply an assessment on property tax.
Okay, yeah, no, I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, what's called? I just haven't heard the word in a while.
Yeah, so it's that assessment for property owners. So their percentage is the highest. They were the first. The second district that had the legislation to enable them to become effective was Southwest Florida. And by then, the current legislators were saying, well, we can't let them, this isn't working. That's too much autonomy. That's too much control that South Florida has. So they tightened the strings on South Florida. So South Florida then has incrementally the next highest millage rate, but they also have a bit more checks and balances. We were the third, same thing. We've got the third highest, then Swanee, the fourth highest. And by the time you got to North Florida Water Management District, who had no wetland regulatory program until the ERP rule, and even before and even later than that, because the legislature just pretty much said, no, no ability to tax, no ability to have any autonomy. So everything was controlled by the time Northwest Florida came around. So because of that, we all districts can operate differently when it comes to what the board can and cannot do. So there's a bit of a home rule, and this is our turf, and this is our constituents. And because South Florida, has less control, and again, this is an opinion, it takes a little bit more effort to get them to come on board to think statewide, big picture, as opposed to as what they feel their mandate is, which is to serve the population and the resources of their district.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was almost like a trial and error type of like deal where it's like, you're a little bit looser at the first one, but then as you kind of learn more and more lessons, you start getting stricter and stricter as you can
Right.
see what doesn't work.
Right. Well, that's one way of looking at it. I think it was more just an issue of property owners and developers realizing that they had less ability to influence decisions.
So let's talk about the a little bit more. So obviously, like with a lot of the projects you kind of just mentioned, you're dealing with a lot of different types of stakeholders, right? Farmers, whether it's land developers, whether it's the county, or different cities. Discuss your. That's it's a really complicated topic, right? It's really hard to kind of find a balance between all these different people's needs plus the environments. How did you kind of go about? What was your own personal governing philosophy when it came to approaching those types of issues?
Well, again, for me, it was, what is the mission statement of the district? And what do our rules say? So recommendations that I made and our staff made were based on how we looked at a project or a permit application or an issue relative to what the rules guided us to do. And recognizing that all districts are a pretty bottom to top organic issue, and we all recognize that there are folks above us, at least I did, that may have to make different decisions. And all I can do is make my recommendation and move it up the chain, and they either supported it or they modified it or they didn't support it. But my job was to represent it as how it met or did not meet our rules. And just one thing I have to say is that when I started with the district, we were in a period of growth and just learning to walk. The training wheels had been on during the early 80s. When I started, the training wheels kind of came off. I started at a pretty exciting time because in 89, our district was selected by the Department of Environmental Protection to be the first water management district to do a test delegation of the state's permitting program, the dredge and fill permit. So we started implementing the state's dredge and fill permitting program along with our management of surface and storage water, MSSW permit program. So we were then doing two programs. I don't know in your interviews if you know, but St. John's is the only district of the 5 districts that has a special basin rule. We have 3 special basin rules. First one was implemented in 89, became effective fall of 89. So, I transitioned right into being the principal person of applying the Wekiva River protection criteria, which included an established riparian habitat protection zone, which basically along the Wekiva River and several other of the named rivers that are in that basin, we were applying an extra level of review criteria that included uplands. It wasn't just wetlands. It was if you work in, the riparian habitat protection zone, which could be the area of wetlands and uplands 550 feet from the stream's edge or 50 feet from the wetland edge, whichever was greater in distance, any construction in that area was presumed harmful, period. So as before, most other permits are, you just have to demonstrate that you won't be adverse. This is the first time that in the state of Florida, the criteria was established that said, construction here is harmful. Then in 91, we implemented the Econ River hydrologic basin criteria with another RHPZ. And then in 95, we implemented the Tomoka River, Spruce Creek River RHPZs. But at that period of time, the political environment in the state of Florida was such that we could do that.
Who's the governor?
Pardon?
Who's the governor at that time?
We would have started with Graham. I think that we had Martinez in there for a while, who was governor, but Martinez came from Water Management District history. And then we had Childs.
Yeah, so it's kind of a, I mean, if I recall correctly, Graham was a Democrat, Martinez was a Republican, and then Childs was a Democrat again.
Democrat, that's correct.
But still, I mean, despite the differences in political party, I mean, all three of them, from my understanding, had a pretty similar philosophy in the districts. They're all pretty pro-environment. To a healthy degree.
To a degree, but then it started to change when you had Jeb Bush that came in. Jeb was then by Christ, and then we had Scott, and we are where we are now. And what I have seen is that the other thing that happened is, even though we had the governors at a certain level, our legislature demographics started changing significantly. With local elections, it started going Republican more so than what was reflected in the governor's office. And what happened is after we got the Tomoka rule through, things started going through legislature that started pushing our limits in. The rules weren't being changed, but certain things were happening that changed what's the word I'm looking for? For instance, a third party could object to a permit application and not have to demonstrate that they had real cause.
So the rules remain the same, but let's just say the ability to challenge the rules, or
they started changing things so that third party objectors had to be somebody that could demonstrate cause. Then there was the Burton Act, I think it was, which basically said that we couldn't enact any new rules without doing an economic impact analysis on what that new rule would have over existing rules.
And when was that passed?
That was in the mid-90s.
Okay.
Right? When that happened, no more special basins occurred. Right? Because the next target for a special basin that we had, based on our board structure and the community involvement, would have been the Matanzas Pellicer Creek. Already had everything in position to move in that direction. But when that rule was enacted by legislature, it made it basically impossible to create new rules. Right? Then the legislature also enacted a rule that said that you cannot regulate by policy. It has to be by rule. So you can't just say, okay, the governing board feels that for the best interest of the water resources in our boundary, we need to do this. You now have to create a rule that has to go through the whole rulemaking process, which ultimately ends up in Tallahassee with legislature, in JAPSI, the judicial, what is it? I'm not going to remember my acronyms, but there's two levels of review of new rules that occur in Tallahassee at the legislative level. And if they don't like it, you get your thumbs down. So you had now a cost analysis, and if somebody was going to be impacted, you had to compensate that individual by enacting your new rule. Right? And then the legislature also passed a rule that made parties of administrative hearings and litigation, the losing party, responsible financially to pay for losses in litigation.
So is that what you're referring to?
Pardon?
The lawyer fees, is that what you're referring to?
Lawyer fees, or even lost revenue. So if a developer said, this litigation caused me from being able to break ground for 12 months, and I missed a peak market opportunity, and this is my financial hit, they could be financially responsible based on this new legislation that was passed. Google Maggie Hurchella, former county commissioner in Martin County.
Maggie
Hurchella. I'll look it up and see if I can spell it.
Yeah, if you want maybe that to me, that'll be great.
Yeah, if you Google her, it's very interesting because she was a county commissioner and very pro smart growth. And she got sued by a developer and lost. And they held her financially responsible. And she took it all the way to the Supreme Court. She basically died in debt.
And the risk of repeating myself, this you mentioned that this all started occurring with kind of, let's say, the legislative demographic changes beginning in the mid-90s, and it's kind of bled onto, let's say, till now.
Until now. And now, then we went through.
I didn't realize it was that far back. I mean, it's like I think a lot of people kind of have this this idea that this is the result of the last maybe 10, 15 years, but no, this is 25 years worth of kind of erosion.
It has been. It's been a very slow, by 1,000 paper cuts. And I kick myself because, I just preparing for this mentally, I was just thinking through, we used to have permit applicants come in and they would complain and they'd yell and call us names or get upset. And we just, had a certain haughtiness about us. I was just like, well, if you don't like the rule, I'm just administering the rule. This is what the rule says. If you don't like it, talk to your senator. Well, somebody did. You've frozen up, Vasilios.